Governments, in order to exercise power, need to be able to communicate with their people. And this involves not only having information and ideas, but also some influence over the communications infrastructure in order to distribute them. There are generally three main goals for government's communications policy. First of all, they want to promote national security. Second, to develop a national identity. And third, to support economic development. In terms of developing a national identity, one example comes from Canada. On the Canadian Broadcast Corporation's website, you can still hear the first nationwide radio broadcast from July 1st, 1927, the Diamond Jubilee, a celebration of 60 years as a nation. In preparation for the festivities, the Canadian government had asked radio stations, telegraph companies, and telephone companies to cooperate to enable this nationwide transmission. In the process, the telephone companies realized that their network was not nearly as robust as the telegraph companies' networks, and this spurred them to invest more in their nationwide infrastructure. In Canadian history, the development of the telephone network, the telegraph network, and the railways are key to the development of a national identity that spans east and west, in tension with the North and South Pole between the US and Canada. An example of government policy that affected national security: in the 1860s in the United States, Abraham Lincoln was the first American president to rely on the telegraph for war tactics. His generals communicated regularly through the telegraph about troop movements, and this communication infrastructure was key to the success of the Union against the Confederacy. In terms of economic development, China is a good example. 100 years later, during the economic reforms of the 1980s and 1990s, the government invested heavily in the telephone network. Within a couple of decades, the network went from shambles to one of the largest telephone networks in the world. Not only did economic activity spur demand for telephone service, but also telephone service enabled better communication and improved business activity. Now, I don't mean to leave the impression that every government initiative to use communications infrastructure succeeds in improving national security, developing national identity, or promoting economic development. There are examples, for example, one from Brazil in the 1900s, where the government sought to develop a telegraph network. The original purpose of the telegraph network was military. When there were military incursions from neighboring countries in the Amazon, sometimes it took 5 or 6 weeks for the capital in Rio to hear about it. Brazil, as a new nation, decided that building a telegraph network would be in its national security interest. It would improve its control over the hinterlands. There was also hope, however, that the telegraph network would be used for economic activity, and that would help the development of the Amazon region. Unfortunately, the network's service was primarily used by the military and the government alone, and the commercial development never materialized. Without the revenue from commercial development, the maintenance of the telegraph network suffered, and eventually it fell into disrepair. So while governments seek to use communications infrastructure for their goals of national security, developing national identity, and economic development, it doesn't mean that they always succeed.